This is looking at the poem Disabled by Wilfred Owen. And there are two reasons why you might be looking at this poem if you're doing the edXL IGCSE. One might be for coursework, one might be for the exam. And if you're doing it for the exam, obviously you need to kind of listen to this video and listen to the kind of what your teacher said about it and any notes and things that you've got, drawing ideas from those as well. And making sure that you walk into the exam with enough to say about it that you're confident to talk about. So it's making sure that, you're not trying to write everything down and memorize everything for an exam, but you are trying to come up with enough to really get a good and developed essay out of it. For either coursework or for exam, or indeed for any writing about any poem, we're not just going to go through and feature spot. That means we're not just going to pick out those kind of methods that the poets used. What we're always going to do is connect the method and the choices the writers made to the effect they're having. And when you're annotating, please make sure that you've made a note of both things. Don't just go through and write repetition, metaphor, etc., etc. So I'm going to take it that you've read the poem and you've got a general idea of what it's about. So this is dealing with a description by a third-person omniscient narrator. So that omniscient means that they are all-knowing. Right? It's not told from the soldier's perspective, right? What actually Owen's doing is he's using this third person narrator, and he is allowing that narrator access into the disabled soldier's thoughts. So it's not the disabled soldier saying, I am sitting in a wheelchair. We're very much kind of one step removed, but we do know what memories he's kind of reflecting on, what he's thinking, what his hopes were, what his fears are. And Owen uses this idea to compare, to juxtapose how the soldier's life used to be with how it now is. So if you're using this idea of juxtaposition, it's not a straight kind of opposites. It means that it's placing instead these ideas side by side. So in a moment, I'm going to give you a kind of sentence or two to kind of sum up the story of the poem. But I just want to make sure that we know what we're talking about first. So we've got this idea of, the soldier has been a very young man. There's evidence in the poem that he has lied about his age to be able to join up, that he was too young, but, they quite happily accepted him. He's become horribly injured, and now he's back in England after the war, or at least after his part in the war. His life has dramatically changed for the worse. His injuries look like he's lost his legs and his arms, and therefore he's moved from being active as, a young man with all of this hope and potential and future in front of him, to being now kind of somebody who is physically extremely limited and psychologically damaged. So what we can do is we can capture some of this vocabulary to make sure that we've got that there. So he's now said physically limited. He's now moved to being more passive than active. So he's now kind of waiting to be wheeled round, waiting to be kind of helped and assisted, rather than running round as he used to. He is psychologically damaged, as well as physically injured. And we know that he's never named, so he becomes a universal symbol. Okay, what that means is that, this soldier, because he's not given a name, we don't know, who he is, where he was born, we don't know his individual story. He starts to stand for all of those soldiers in that position. So, we can say that Owen is using this young man as a universal symbol, as symbolizing all of those young men who were injured and affected by the war and by war generally. Okay. So you might want to kind of start, if you're doing any sort of introductory comment, either in an exam or coursework or so, that Owen's poem juxtaposes the active and exuberant, or the active and exhilarating, or the active and lively life the soldier used to lead before he was seriously injured in a war that he had been keen to participate in, right? It explores ideas of lost potential, lost hope, the impact of war on individuals, and maybe the kind of ongoing effect of war, rather than the immediate injury. If we look at the title Disabled, we can actually now say that this man is defined by his injuries. Okay, so, you know, this isn't anything that he's being hailed automatically as a returning hero, or his sacrifice is being acknowledged. When the able-bodied world are seeing him, maybe when those people who haven't been to the war are seeing him, what they're seeing is the condition he's in now. And that shouldn't be the case. And obviously now we know that if you are disabled, then you are, you know, certainly shouldn't be defined by your disabilities. But Owen, in terms of choosing to call the poem Disabled, is kind of really highlighting that as a huge impact. We have, he sat in a wheeled chair waiting for dark. We have two words here which are kind of highlighting that kind of passive approach. That's passive as in not active. Okay? We have the kind of immediate thing that his mobility is compromised, and the dark that he's waiting for may be the kind of day into night. So it's the kind of, all he can do is wait for the passing of time. You know, his days have moved one into another. But also we can talk about the kind of psychological darkness. And I know I keep writing psychological, but really do learn how to spell it. If you can nail that first bit, then it's such a useful word for writing about all sorts of texts, right? So it's also the kind of psychological darkness. There may be this idea that he knows that this is going to overcome him at some point. And already we can see we've got this caesura here and this end stop here, which is giving that kind of paced out, slow tone to it. In a moment, you know, we're going to see that really it's iambic pentameter throughout. So that 10-syllable de-dum, 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 de-dum beat, which adds to the kind of sense of monotony and regularity, the idea that, you know, there's nothing exciting happening in his life now. But Owen does actually vary the meter in places. So we can talk about, you know, those effects when we come across them, and we can look at why that is, right? So it's largely in regular iambic pentameter with some variations to create specific effects. And again, for an exam, you don't need to memorize all of them. I'd look at maybe two, and then you can talk about the regularity, and you can contrast it with these exceptions, and you can say something meaningful about those exceptions. So he sat and shivered. Okay, so we've got that idea of his vulnerability. You know, he's vulnerable in his ghastly suit of grey. And I would talk about the connotations, okay, those connections and associations of the colour grey. Okay, so it is kind of pallid, that word that kind of means unhealthily pale, right? It's like all of the colour has been drained from him and washed out of him. You can contrast it later with the kind of purple spurt, all of the ideas that, you know, he was going to have this really colourful, active life. And it's all drained away at this point. okay? And what we notice about him is he's passive, he's shivering, so he's vulnerable, he's waiting, legless in terms of, literally legless, literally he does not, he's lost his legs, and sewn short at elbow would be, rather than having a prosthesis at that point, just kind of turning up the sleeve of somebody's clothes so you couldn't see the stump of their arm. So it's kind of folded back on itself and sewn up. So we have this idea of, he is very much kind of damaged physically by the war. And that, again, in those first 2.5 lines is what's defining him. That's what you see, this man who is kind of physically compromised. Through the park, voices of boys ran saddening like a hymn, voices of play and pleasures after day, till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. Okay, so he is sitting outside, and later on, it's like, why don't they come and get him? And we have the kind of contrast of the park with the images of conflict and war that we're going to evoke later. If you evoke something, then you kind of summon it up, call it up. And, the idea of the park should be somewhere where he's running around, where he's kind of excited and happy to be. And through the park, voices of boys and voices of play. So this anaphora, okay, that is where you have repetition of a word or words at the start of successive sentences or clauses. We have what he can hear, right? It's almost like kind of he can't turn off from this kind of outside world that's carried on. And through the park, you can hear the voices of boys, and with all of their connotations of that innocence and hope and potential that went with his life at one point. We have the kind of musicality and the celebration of rang, and then the contrast of saddening like a hymn. Okay, so it's kind of got this beauty of the boys' voices, almost like a choir. The idea that, all he can do is maybe pray or think of kind of, pray to God about what he's lost. It shouldn't be that a hymn is saddening. A hymn should be kind of celebratory. So his worldview appears to have changed with that simile. It's something that shouldn't be sad, and yet it is. So the simile kind of challenges your idea of faith. Voices of play and pleasures after day. So we've got that plosive alliteration on the P, the D, and the D, that energy and activity that he can hear all around him. But gathering sleep had mothered them from him. So these boys, their sleep is far more benign. Okay, benign is harmless. Okay, it's this idea of they are collected together by their need to rest. This is a comforting and soothing idea, the verb to mother, to look after something. And it's kind of sad because these boys, they're getting tired and they're being looked after in a way that is far more tender and far more sort of natural and with the natural cycle of life than the people who are looking after him. And so, regular life is taking away any comfort from him. And we can't help but think maybe of the sleep that is a euphemism for death, maybe of his comrades that haven't come home, and the idea that, he's losing something daily. We look then at line 6, and the focus in this stanza shifts a little bit when he remembers, what it used to be like. It used to be that the kind of darkening day, the end of the day, didn't have all those sad connotations, all of those kind of connotations of loss and distress that it has now, with that kind of almost pathetic fallacy sense of getting darker, right? It used to herald, it used to mark the start of the evening. When he was a young man, it was something to look forward to, because the town used to swing so gay when glow lamps budded in the light blue trees. So here in this stanza, in fact, we're just going to kind of note that we've got 2 words that we would put different connotations on today. And you take them in the sense that Owen meant them, which is the idea that we're using gay and queer, not as references to sexuality, but references to kind of happiness or liberation or freedom. So town used to swing so gay. It's like things used to be so happy. It used to be joyous. There used to be kind of, celebration when glow lamps budded in the light blue trees. So we go to this idea of, the natural and the unnatural being kind of put together in a way that was beautiful. You've got glow lamps budded. Budded is again that idea of potential. If something has potential, it's got that future possibility to it. And the lamps were budding in the trees. It was kind of hinting that this is going to be a brilliant night. Light blue trees. It's got that kind of idea of lights coming on that are unnatural and sort of man-made, but in a good way, that this is going to be, the time when people are in bars and are in clubs and are generally sort of, going to dances at this point. And girls glanced lovelier as the air grew dim. Okay, that idea of the glance, that quick look, it's got that idea of the hope and the possibility. She's looking at me, what's going to happen? But also the idea that there's this sense of underlying feeling that this is kind of temporary, that these things don't last. A glance is a very quick look and then away again. As the air grew dim, and again we just get this kind of sense of things darkening. Again, by that end stop, there's something interrupted, something unfinished there, because the air growing dim is now again this psychological darkness, if you like, that we alluded to in the first line, that he remembers in line 10 in the old times before he threw away his knees. So he's thinking, it used to be great, that was before. Okay, so the old times, and that caesura after the old times gives that moment of reflection. We're using caesura, remember, to mark any punctuation in the middle of a line of poetry. Now, the idea of before he threw away his knees, the connotations of that phrase, it's slightly informal, and it implies that, this was something he wasted. You throw rubbish away, but in signing up so hastily without really appreciating what he was doing, he, has actually kind of got rid of his future. He's casually kind of tossed it away, threw away his knees, taking, his knees, his legs, to mean his entire future, his entire kind of, life as he thought it was going to be. And then we flick back into the present day to say now he will never feel again how slim girls' waists are or how warm their subtle hands. It's this idea that he won't dance, and using dance as a kind of symbol for that grace and elegance and togetherness, and again possibility. It's that coming together, that movement within another human being, because now all of the girls touch him like he has a sort of strange disease. Okay, and if you think, it's the touch is no longer one of kind of attraction, one of kind of excitement. It's now kind of that strangely kind of emotionally distant or reserved. The best almost he can hope for is kind of pity, whereas the worst he gets is kind of people don't want anything to do with him because they're not quite sure how to deal with what's happened to him. So this strange disease that he's there, and it kind of, I suppose it shows how people don't know how to react in difficult situations. Right. Line 16, looking at the next one, there was an artist silly for his face, for it was younger than his youth last year. A whole lot to unpackage there. The idea that he was so beautiful at one point that this artist was crazy to paint him. He was like the epitome. The epitome is the height. Okay. of kind of, young masculine beauty. So much so that, an artist would go crazy to paint him. And his face was younger than his youth. This is a, kind of strange little paradoxical phrase. How can you be younger than your youth? It uses polyptoton. Okay. Now, if you can't remember that, don't worry about it. Okay. All polyptoton is it's the idea of using the same root idea in different forms of the word. And it's just kind of emphasizing here that his youth was everywhere. His beauty was in all sorts of forms. It's saying he looked young. Like he actually looked younger than he was. And also we know that, he was really young because, he was too young to sign up. And this was only last year. And again, caesura end stop. Short kind of clause there, but how much has changed for this soldier? Now he is old. We've got this repetition of this word now, as we keep kind of coming back to this, how much has changed, marked there. He is old. It's a metaphor, okay? He actually isn't old. He's still young, but this metaphorical aging has happened. He has kind of prematurely aged. Okay, my bad handwriting there, that's an E. Okay, his back will never brace. And again, that plosive alliteration. He'll never, if you imagine when you're dancing with somebody, and you hold your back rigid, think Strictly Come Dancing. And, he's never going to be able to do that. Maybe the brace that he's thinking about is now more like the kind of supports he's got on himself. He can't hold himself up. He's being supported. He's lost his colour very far from here. So we can link that to the grey comment in the grey suit. And we start to get, the loss there. Far from here is a reference to the kind of battlefields of Europe. And his colour was poured down shell holes till the veins ran dry. And the idea of losing something is unintentional. But then we get this kind of, again, it links in with he's thrown away his knees. He poured his colour away. That sense that what he has done, his decision to join the army, has actually inadvertently, and if you're inadvertent about something, inadvertently led to, these injuries and this future for him. Something being inadvertent is where it's kind of accidental. It's not intended. Okay, and the shell holes are the blast holes in the battlefield, and the battlefield has taken all of his lifeblood. He has poured his blood until, again, metaphorically, because he didn't actually bleed out on the battlefield. He will have seen people who did, but metaphorically, he's poured away his future, his life, his energy, his color. And we get this repetition of and, a bit more anaphora, you can call it polysyndeton, in terms of that list, that repetition of a conjunction. And half his lifetime lapsed in the hot race, and leap of purple spurted from his thigh. So we've got some quite nice, if nice is the right word for it, some quite nice stuff going on here. This idea of lapse, something falling behind, losing. If you lap somebody in a race, you kind of overtake them. If you kind of you're losing that race. It's like when this injury happened to him, he lost half of his life expectancy. He lost all of his future and his potential. This hot race is a race to kind of stay alive, as well as this kind of, the energy and the activity of war. And a leap of purple spurted from his thigh. The assonance there and the kind of slight internal rhyme going on to kind of get the internal rhyme. And assonance is repetition of a assonance, repetition of a vowel sound. The idea that when he actually gets injured, it's that kind of blood pumping through this purple spur, doof, doof, yeah? So it's mimicking that kind of severity, the seriousness of that injury. And we have the and the anaphora there, kind of creating that sense of inevitability. you know, once it's started, it just carries on, and this happens and this happens. And a leap of purple, the kind of energy, the unstoppableness is now his blood kind of pumping out, draining away, and everything that signifies. Now, I said before that we were going to pick up on the exceptions to the iambic pentameter. You've got one there in hot race. Rather than it being a dum-dum, D-dum, it's a stress. So it's actually called a spondy. But if you just want to say the double stress on the hot race, kind of shows the speed and the intensity of it. The other one I was going to point out that I completely forgot was the voices and voices up here. That, rather than being a D-dum, is a dum-D. So it's actually the trochee. So you can again, you don't need to remember trochee. Just say, you know, the variation to the iambic meter shows the kind of calling of the voices, maybe, or kind of emphasizes, you know, how they cut through into his consciousness. Okay, so, you know, we get from line 20, that purple spurt brings us to the past again, because at one point he liked seeing blood on his leg when it was a bit of a you know, sign of his masculinity, when it was this idea that actually, you know, you can have a bit of a kind of injury and people think, well, that's just you and your football, or you and your rugby. It was a sign of his strength and prowess. But, you know, it's very, very different from what he actually gets in the war. And, you know, the idea that he's being carried shoulder high maybe also implicitly contrasts with being carried off a battlefield. But, you know, this was his memory, as it was after football when he drunk a peg, you know, and linking this idea of his image of his own masculinity with his desire then to join up. So he'd had a bit to drink, you know, after football, he was kind of on a high, you know, and he thought he'd better join. He thought he'd better kind of sign up. And that kind of, again, the caesura there, he wonders why. And it's the kind of end stop has got the sort of finality of that reflection in terms of what it's cost him, you know, and the reflection on it. Someone said he'd look a god in kilts. So that idea of, again, you know, it's appealing to his vanity. So here we have somebody who didn't sign up because of his patriotism. This wasn't a kind of love of country. This is a kind of, you know, young man, younger than you'd think, who wants to kind of appear like, you know, the big man, decided, yeah, well, the thing to do to impress the women is to become a soldier. So, you know, he would look a god in kilts, and it could be that, you know, he's thinking of the Scottish uniform with all the kind of kilt and all the decoration on it. And that's why, and maybe too, to please his Meg. So to, you know, to please his girl. That was it, to please the giddy jilts he asked to join. Giddy jilts, you know, giddy is if you're kind of giggly and superficial. And he realizes now that, you know, it was kind of pointless. There wasn't any substance or meaning behind it. Jilts is a kind of, you know, another word for kind of just giggly women, I guess. To please them, he asked to join. So this kind of colloquial, so that means informal style, and the reflection, you know, he's thinking, he wonders why. Well, why was it? Well, it was all of these reasons. These are not really good enough reasons to end up in the state he's in. And he asked to join. He didn't have to beg. Smiling, they wrote his lie. That is a great kind of metaphor, that they just kind of, you know, everybody goes along with the idea that he's age 19 when he's clearly not. You know, he doesn't think of the enemy. He doesn't think of the kind of fact he's going to have to fight and the patriotism side of it. That all of that doesn't move him. You know, it doesn't impact on him at all. And no fears of fear came yet. You know, that kind of capitalization of fear as this huge, big concept, almost personified. You know, the idea that that is the thing that's going to then take over his life. He doesn't fear fear. And that is that kind of polyliptoton thing again. You know, kind of maybe saying how fear becomes pervasive. If something becomes pervasive, it's everywhere. Okay, it pervades. So he has no fears of fear came yet. And that keyword yet implies that it is going to happen. You know, and again, we have that caesura in there just to give you a minute to say, well, it's the inevitability of it. He thought of jeweled hilts for daggers in plaid socks, you know, and again, this is that like the kilts. This is the kind of ceremonial army. This is the decoration. This is somebody who's interested maybe in superficial appearance. Let me just get the spelling of that. Superficial. Do it again. I can't talk and think at the same time. Superficial. That's right. And the aesthetic. Okay, aesthetic is where something is how something looks. You know, when we talk about something having a great aesthetic, we mean it looks really nice. He's thinking almost of this kind of ceremonial uniform and how it's going to complement this beautiful face he's got and the experience he's had of being, you know, put on people's shoulders and championed through, you know, the rugby field or off the rugby field. You know, this jeweled knife, the hilt of a knife is the kind of handle of it. And again, it's all this color and glamour and ceremony. You know, he thinks of smart salutes and care of arms. So care of arms being weapons, you know, kind of drills, doing your gun and making sure, you know, you've got all of it. None of this is actual fighting. You know, he thinks of the leave, he thinks of the time off, and he thinks of getting paid. And he thinks of, you know, the camaraderie there, the esprit de corps. You know, so it's all of the advantages, the kind of things that the young recruits, if you are recruited, you know, you're called up to, not quite called up because that will be a conscription, but you join in something, right? So he thinks of all the positive things and he doesn't have any idea of what he's getting himself into. So this list really does show his naivety, his innocence, you know. And then soon he was drafted out with drums and cheers. So he gets what he wants on the way out, right? But then that cheer at the end of that line and that stanza, again, this polyptoton, the cheers then transform into, well, what happens when he gets home? And here's another cheer. Well, you know, all of the ceremony and the pomp and the celebration that, you know, they're going to war, they all go, and some cheer when he gets back, but not as crowds cheer goals. So there's none of that celebration. There's no kind of, you know, idea of getting coming home to a hero's welcome. Some, not all, you know, there are some people who are happy to have him home, some people who kind of go out to mark the return of the injured soldiers, but this is not this kind of game. You know, it's very much not a game coming home. These are not the returning sporting heroes, you know, that you would see kind of touted through the streets. He actually gets a solemn man who brought him fruits, thanked him, and then inquired about his soul. Okay, and so this idea that, you know, it's very common to say, you know, thank you for your service, especially in America, to veterans. And, you know, this very serious man brought him some fruit and thanked him for what he'd done, and then inquired about his soul. So the idea that, you know, it's kind of, well, what is happening to you at a more kind of fundamental and more spiritual level now? And you almost don't know whether this man means, you know, genuine care and wants to help him, or whether or not this man is trying to figure out for himself exactly how you go about coping with that kind of situation and that type of injury, whether or not, you know, the man wants to see, you know, has he still got his faith in God when that has happened to him? You know, somebody trying to find maybe his own answers. But this italicizing of thanked him kind of makes it seem underwhelming. You know, what can happen? He doesn't get cheered. Well, you know, this one man saying thank you is not, you know, exactly what he had in mind when he went off to war in so many ways. And we get this final now. Again, on line 40, he will spend modal verb. So we have that kind of certainty about it. He'll spend a few sick years in institutes. So few is not very many. And those years, the limited life he does have left, and he doesn't know how much life he has left, will be tainted, tarnished, compromised by his illness. And he'll be in institutes. This idea of the kind of organized care, being looked after. He'll be in homes, basically, in kind of accommodation where he can be helped. And again, we have the and the and. Everything I said before about the ands, you know, they're all the way through, that building sense of inevitability. He will do what things the rules consider wise and take whatever pity they may dole. So he's stuck, you know, he's got to follow the doctor's advice. He's got to follow the rules of the homes. He's basically going to be institutionalized, and he has no control. He has no autonomy over his life. Autonomy is your independence. Okay, so he is now, again, as he started the poem, completely passive. He's got to do what he's told, and he's got to accept the pity they give out. Okay, if you think of dole being, you know, to dole something out is to give things out. So all they're going to give him is pity. And tonight he noticed how the women's eyes passed from him to the strong men that were whole. Contrast that with the kind of, you know, the glances of the lovely girls earlier that he knows all about. And it's not like he doesn't know what's going on. You know, mentally, he is absolutely aware of what's happened. And he can see, you know, people don't want to look at him. The women kind of just, you know, the glances now are skimming over him to the strong men that were whole. And that again is whole physically and psychologically, right? Because he is now kind of damaged, right? Strong men. So ironically, his whole idea is, you know, he wanted to be one of those men who was attracting all the women, and it's actually had the opposite effect. And then we really do kind of get this glimpse into his thoughts, his internal monologue, how cold and late it is. And that again is both literal and metaphorical. It is cold because his feelings are kind of, you know, people are withdrawn, he is withdrawn. It's late because his life is passing, ticking away. That darkness, that coming of the night is the coming of his metaphorical night. If the metaphor is, you know, the day is his life. Why don't they come and put him into bed? Why don't they come? So those questions, the kind of, you know, we can say they're rhetorical questions in terms of, you know, why don't they come? They need to come now. But also, you know, he's accepting his fate. He just needs to be put into bed. He doesn't want to be here anymore. He wants to turn off for another day. It's also kind of, you know, maybe thinking about the end of his life. Why, you know, what use does he think he is now? Why don't they come and, you know, just switch him off, as it were? Why doesn't everything stop? But why don't they come to kind of, you know, help him end the day, or metaphorically kind of more take him away from this kind of constant flicking backwards and forwards in terms of what he was, what he had, what he lost, what he's got, and his limited future. So that kind of, you know, the ending on those questions is the uncertainty of his future and his kind of doubt, and the idea that he, you know, really is struggling with the life that he now has, and his own kind of part in how that life came about. So you can really kind of look at this poem from the perspective of kind of Owen's other poetry being kind of really counselling against that jingoism of the time. You know, Owen was not one of these patriotic, here we all go for glorious England poets. He was very much a kind of, this is horrific, it is this awful waste of life. There is a sense of kind of brutality and futility in this, to use futility to, you know, use the name of one of his other poems. I would be looking at trying to group together images if you're talking about this, and group together techniques and their effect. So you've got the colour, you've got the juxtaposition of past and present, you've got the loss of potential, you've got lots of kind of repetition of different types. really, there's an awful lot to say about this. The idea is, if you're doing it for coursework, picking the best bits that complement your argument. If you're doing it for the exam, going through and thinking, right, okay, in the exam, what kind of 5 or 6 points, maybe kind of slightly more if you're aiming for the top end of the mark scheme, am I going to be really happy to talk about? Can I layer my points so I'm not just talking about a metaphor, I'm maybe talking about the plosive alliteration or the repetition or the connection with something else? I'm always talking about the feature with the effect, never just the feature. Okay, I hope this has helped. Bye now.